Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Russia, and specifically to talk about the ongoing squeeze that Russian businesses are now facing. They are seeing their profit margins being wiped out, and lots of businesses in Russia are now making losses. We don't get much data from the Kremlin. They've severely restricted the amount of information that they're prepared to share with the West. But one of the things that we do get is the producer price index, also referred to as factory gate prices. So, this is the price of products when they're leaving factories and other businesses in Russia. And this chart shows the latest data for producer prices. And you can see a very clear trend here. If we look at the scale on the right hand side, it goes from 10% positive at the top to minus 7% at the bottom. And you can see that over the past 12 months, there has been a huge fall in producer prices. And in the last 3 months, November, December, and January, they've moved into negative territory. And in fact, if you look back to July, Russian businesses have really been struggling with producer prices since then. In fact, it goes back till May. So, for most of the last year, Russian businesses haven't really been able to pass on any cost increases. And the latest data for January shows that year on year, producer prices are down by 5%. Now, that is an absolute nightmare because as a business, if your costs are rising, you need to be able to pass on those cost increases in the form of higher prices. But Russian businesses are having to cut their prices. So that means that they're absorbing any cost increases, and that's wiping out their profit margins. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening since the war in Ukraine started, this goes back over the past 5 years. You can see that in 2021, before the war started, producer prices were actually increasing rapidly. Now, this was the period following the closure of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we saw this huge increase in demand, and lots of businesses ran around trying to produce things. So producer prices went up across the board everywhere. But you can see that in 2022, they were still going up by more than 20% at the start of that year. However, as soon as the war in Ukraine started, producer prices started to come down, and they actually moved into negative territory at the end of 2022 and the start of 2023. However, in 2024, they returned to double digit growth. So things were going quite well on paper for Russian businesses. But as I'm sure you'll be aware if you follow the channel, Russia has now split into a sort of two-tier economy. We've got the businesses that are being sponsored by the Kremlin, who are helping with the war effort. So they've been paid handsomely. They don't have to worry about the final end price because they've got guaranteed contracts from the state to produce whatever it is that they're making. And then we've got the commercial businesses that are still having to compete globally, despite the fact that Russia has been hit with this huge wave of sanctions. So they don't have access to most of the markets that they used to sell their products to. So those businesses are the ones that are really suffering right now. And you can see that the latest move into negative territory in producer prices is the first time that this has happened since the start of 2023. So this isn't something that's been going on for a long time. This is basically a new phenomenon, and it's really bad news for Russian businesses. And we look at what's happening month on month. So this is just looking at the change this month compared to last month. You can see the same trend as we saw for the yearly movement. But if we look at what's happened in January, month on month, producer prices fell by 2.5%. That is a huge fall in the month. And if you look at the trend here from October through to January, it's severely downward. And if this continues, then clearly Russian businesses are going to see their prices being chopped even further. And we widen the scale of this chart, you can see that 2.5% fall in the month is the worst that's been seen since 2023. So that's over 2 years. So absolute nightmare from Russian businesses' perspective. Now, just before we go on any further today, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? And also I wanted to remind you that I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. If you scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below, that would be great. And if we look at what's happening with inflation, just to remind you, Russia has a real problem with inflation at the moment. This chart shows inflation over the past 12 months. And you can see that for the majority of the last 12 months, inflation has been up around double digit levels. And in January, it came in at 6%, which was an increase on the figure for December. So across the board, prices are rising in Russia. They're rising quite rapidly. But Russian businesses aren't benefiting from that. So despite the fact that Russian individuals are paying more for all of the products that they're buying, Russian businesses aren't making more profit. They're actually making a smaller profit. They're cutting their profit margins. So, what that tells us is that the increase in prices isn't being driven by Russian companies, it's being driven by imports. And obviously, that makes sense because of the sanctions in place against Russia. They're now having to pay more for all imported goods. And despite the fact that the ruble has, on paper, increased in value, so therefore there should be more purchasing power when you're buying things internationally. Because no countries are accepting payments in rubles, it hasn't had any beneficial impact whatsoever. And if you look at what's been happening with inflation over the past 5 years, you can see that it's been persistently high. So all of the fall in producer prices is basically wiping out profits for Russian businesses. And this is obviously not sustainable. If you run a business, you can't constantly see your profit margins falling and maybe even falling into losses because at some point you'll go bankrupt. Now, if we look at the costs in Russia, just to take into account what's happening on the other side for Russian businesses, this chart shows the movement in real wages in Russia over the past 12 months. And it shows that in the latest data we've got, which isn't perfect, we don't have the data for December or January yet. Russia hasn't released it. But the latest data that we've seen shows that real wages rose by 5.8%. Now, real wages is over and above what's happening with inflation. So if we add that figure to the latest inflation data of 6%, then that tells us that wages have increased by around 11.8%. So that's obviously bad news if you're seeing a reduction in the end price of your product, but your wages have gone up. So that's basically going to bite into your margin. And if we look at what the inflation expectations are in Russia at the moment, they're coming in at around 13.1% in February. That's what Russian households and consumers expect to happen to prices this month. So that tells us that people on the streets are actually paying a lot more than the actual inflation data is telling us. So prices are going one way, but producer prices are going the other way. Now, one of the other big costs that Russian businesses have is debt. If you're making losses or you've seen your profit margins being wiped out, then the only way to fund that is through borrowing money from the bank. And the problem with doing that is that borrowing money in Russia at the moment is super expensive. This chart shows what's been happening with interest rates over the past 5 years. And you can see that before the war in Ukraine started, 5 years ago, interest rates were sitting at 4%. That's pretty healthy. But since the war started, they have taken off. They rose to 20% immediately following the invasion, came back down to around 7.5%. Then in 2025 went back up to 21%. Now they're currently sitting at 15.5%. That's the official borrowing rate. However, banks charge a profit margin over and above that. And this table shows what's been happening with bank lending rates over the past 12 months. And it shows that the current rate, if you want to borrow money from the bank, if you're a business, on average is 18.8%. That is really expensive. That's basically credit card lender values. So if you're a business in Russia, you're having to pay 18.8% on your debt on average. Now, if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, 5 years ago, that price was around 5.9%. So that represents an increase, a huge increase of around about 13%. So, and you can see from just the shape of this chart, the negative impact that that's going to have on Russian businesses, because you've got double whammy. You've got, firstly, Russian businesses being forced to take on debt to make up for the losses that they're incurring. And then the cost of that debt has basically tripled over the past 5 years. So this is all an absolute nightmare if you're a Russian business at the moment. And just to make things worse, taxes have also gone up. This is what's been happening with corporate tax, so basically the tax on your profits. It was increased on the 1st of January 2025 from the previous rate of 20% to the latest rate of 25%. That is a big hike in corporate tax. So that's going to take out cash flow for businesses that are making a profit. If you're making a profit, you're now paying 25% of it to the state as tax. And in addition to that, VAT, which is added to the sales price. So shouldn't really have an impact. But the problem with VAT is that it's added to the sales price for all of your inputs. So anything that you're buying in from suppliers in Russia will charge you now 22% VAT versus 20%. So, and that came in on the 1st of January 2026. So we've seen all of these cost increases for Russian businesses. And I thought it was worth just doing a quick calculation to see what the impact of this will be for average Russian businesses. So I've started off here with a company that was previously making a 20% profit margin. So profit after before interest and tax. So just to keep things simple, if they had a revenue of $100 or 100 rubles, doesn't really make any difference, 100 last year, because we've seen a 5% fall in the PPI, a producer price index, the sales price for their business now will be 95. So that's a 5% cut at the top. If we assume that the material input, so what that business is buying in to make something, is around about 50% of their revenue, then that will have gone up in line with inflation, 6% to around about 54. Wages, if we assume it's around about 21%, then they'll have gone up 11.8%. So they'll be now sitting around 23.5. Other operating expenditure, if we assume that's gone up by inflation as well, then the profit margin would have gone from 20% to around 9% just because of the movements in all of those different prices. If we then look at the increased cost of the debt, 18.8%, I'm assuming here that this business has 20% of its revenue as debt. So if it's turning over 100, then it would have 20 of debt. So it's relatively conservative. Then the cost of that would have increased. Well, it basically would take out almost 4 of profit. So you're looking at a company that previously was making a 20% EBIT operating margin. It's now down to 9. And if we take into account the debt, the cost of the debt, then that would come down from 16 to around about 5. So that's a massive swing. Now, if we look at a company that has a 10% profit margin previously, then that would actually move into loss making. So an EBIT operating margin of 10 would actually be now making negative 1.8. And then if you take into account the interest burden on that, then you're going from EBIT previously of around 6 to a loss of around about 6. And then a company that previously had a 5% EBIT margin, so before interest, it would now be making a loss of over 7 before interest. And then after interest, previously it was making around about 1.24. Now it would be losing 10.91. So I just wanted to give you some examples there, really just to put into perspective what the impact of the fall in producer prices plus the increase in inflation and wages and tax is having on Russian businesses. Lots of Russian businesses are being wiped out as a result of what's happening in Russia. And what this is, of course, is the long-term implication of the sanctions that are in place against Russia. Russia has been driving its economy forward through the switch to being a wartime economy. So the Kremlin is now sponsoring lots of companies to keep the war effort going. And those companies are doing handsomely because they're getting paid by the state. They don't have to worry about marketing and things like producer prices because they just have a contract and they get paid a set amount. But for all of the other businesses in Russia, all of the commercial entities that are having to find buyers and market their products and sell things, they are being completely destroyed by the sanctions and the falling producer prices and the increase in taxes and the increase in borrowing costs and the increase in wages in Russia. So what we're seeing here is that all of these businesses will be basically put out of business, and Russia will end up going back to where it was in the Soviet Union days, where essentially it's funding itself. It doesn't really have any commercial customers globally because of the sanctions. Nobody wants to buy any Russian product. So what we're seeing here is that lots of businesses that have been built up over the last, well, since Russia basically broke away from being in the Soviet Union in 1991. Lots of these businesses entered the global market. They started selling things. Some of them became really big entities. Those businesses are going backwards at the moment. This is destroying their markets, it's destroying their profitability. And you can't continue like this in the long term, because if you're constantly making losses, then you can borrow money from the bank, but at some point you have to pay that money back. If you can't, then you become bankrupt, you go illiquid, and you get closed down. And I think what we're seeing here is lots of businesses in Russia are now in that situation. They're making losses. They're being funded by the banks. They're being supported by the state, essentially through the back door, by the state helping through this lending situation. But it's not sustainable. If you don't have any genuine sales, you don't have any genuine income coming in, then at some point you're going to have to close that business down. So the long-term implication of the sanctions is really destroying a lot of businesses in Russia right now. So I wanted to make this video really just to make you aware of what's going on, and the fact that something like producer prices that you think, oh, who cares about that? It's just data. Nobody really cares about what's happening with PPI. Well, actually, it is really important. And what it tells us is that profits have been wiped out in Russia. Lots of businesses have seen their profits reduce. Many are now in a loss making situation. And that can't continue, because the banks will fund you for a while, but at some point, the merry-go-round has to stop. We saw that with the property developers in China, even though they were being funded by state run banks. At some point, the state says enough is enough, we can't carry on with it. And we've seen companies like Evergrande going bust. And I think what we're going to see in Russia is a similar scenario, where lots of these businesses that are now banking losses won't be able to bank them forever. At some point, the banks will pull the rug. They'll have to close it down. And we will see lots of businesses closing, unemployment in Russia, and it could be going into one of the deepest recessions that Russia has ever experienced. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Really helps me with the algorithm and also makes me a bit happier. So thank you if you've just subscribed. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. You can scan the QR code on the screen now, or click the link in the description below. It will take you through to the independent company that's hosting that on my behalf. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that long-term support. It helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.